Mr. Andy O'Brien, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today for two reasons. One, good friendship has formed over the last couple of years between you and I. So every time we get to chat, that's always fun. You're the first Canadian person I've interviewed. So I feel like I'm getting a little bit of my Canadian card back as
Wow,
a
I like
result of
that.
doing these.
I like that. I'm honored.
Awesome, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm doing great currently down in Florida. So yeah, just enjoying, sort of had a chance to consult with the Panthers here. So enjoying being a fly in the wall during their historic run. That's been pretty cool.
Yeah, not to say that you probably have had quite the hand in helping that along. So I'm sure everyone's very appreciative of what you've been doing. I want to thank you for being a guest on the masterclass. I didn't tell you too much about this, but it's really an interview of an industry professional basically getting to express their genius, who they are, what it is that they've focused on, how they come to be who they are. So I ask everyone the same question to start off, what's your story? What's your background in terms of, what gave you the desire to want to be a top NHL strength coach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of different ways you can go with that, but probably when I was growing up, it was at a time where there wasn't a whole lot of specialization in sports. So nowadays, when you sign up for hockey, dance, figure skating, golf, tennis, whatever that is, you do these really deep dives in these sports. And there's, of course, a lot of peripheral services. And I sort of grew up in a small town, very blue collar, and you just played everything. So I participated competitively in 7 or 8 different sports. And we just have these really short seasons, and then you would kind of matriculate from one to the next and compete against the same people in the same sport, basically. And it was just a different time. And it was a time where I really had a love for just physical activity and overall athleticism. And one of the things that part of my story is when I was 7 years old, I watched the movie Rocky IV, and it came out and had a chance to just marvel at the training montage and this whole idea that you can kind of lose yourself in the pursuit of a goal and use will and determination to go on this journey to take yourself to these higher levels. And so it was just really inspired, like many people, watching those movies. But Rocky IV in particular, I was also really intrigued at how the Russian was approaching the fight and the technology and the science and all of these people with white lab coats and computers, trying to ultimately identify what needs to be done. And the polarities of those two things are pretty neat. And of course, just the music and all the training montage that got built into those fights and the excitement. So probably saw the movie about 100 times, and that planted a seed for me in my own pursuits of sports, is learning to train and learning to apply myself, whether it was plyometrics or running hills, or I used to have this big tire with a heavy rim in it. I used to roll it down the hill to this, like, basically this park that was by my school that had these really steep hills, and pull this tire up the hill backwards, sideways, forwards. And I was just a kid doing this for enjoyment. It was something that I just really could lose myself in. And so that became my intrigue, I think, as I started to climb the ladder in different sports and become more competitive. And I had to figure out strategically how to peak for different things at different times. And into my early 20s, was competitive in sprinting, powerlifting, just sort of finished playing hockey, but really interested at the different ways that you would train based on what your sport was. So got exposed to some elite athletes, and kind of the rest is history. This is around early internet days. So if you were somebody who was really passionate, you could find yourself, getting onto some low tech blog somewhere, downloading someone's opinion of the way to approach something. And it was like gold. You would find some transcript of a conversation or a debate that people would have. And as you started to download these things and read them and interact with other people around the world, this is kind of like a new time. And I think prior to that, people would have to travel and spend time in person. And it was just really transitioning into an era where you could get exposed to a lot of different influences in a relatively short amount of time. So for somebody like myself who was young, it was sort of a new era, if you will, of the internet and people sharing the internet. And at that time, the internet wasn't something that everybody used. It was something that really only the most passionate people would really jump on and navigate this very cumbersome thing. Now it's quite different. We live in a different era now where there's just a massive amount of information at your fingertips. But I think that was really my story, and just sort of started early in my career. I started at the age of 19 or 20 years old, actually, just training minor professional athletes in the summertime because I had a passion for it, and I was doing things myself, and other people in my area were just interested in what they saw me doing and what I was learning, and ended up going to school and learning more in a formal context in addition to what I was doing with all of my own practical learning. And that ended up getting me a job in the NHL eventually. Started a small business, and just started working with some elite athletes in a variety of different sports at the Olympic and professional level, and have been at it about 25 years now.
And I'm sure we could do 2 hours of the best practices and the stories that you've told me, just in some of the things that you've had to deal with athletes and some of the amazing experiences you've had. But I mean, I thank you for that. The thing that was interesting was you became Rocky when you were a kid dragging that tire up the hill. It was like the montage, and now you're more of the white lab coat guy observing. Who knows what they were actually writing down on that paper? I think they were just scribbling for the sake of the movie. But that's
Exactly.
awesome. Thank you so much for the background. I want to ask you a very general question, but I know you're going to have an incredible answer. Subjectively and personally, how would you define fitness?
So I think that there's two ways to approach this. The first way is to really look at it in terms of this task mastery and the ability to sort of repeat those tasks at a certain level of intensity over a certain period of time. So you look at this in terms of strength, mobility, and movement capabilities. You can look at it from a cardiovascular fitness standpoint. It's just really the ability to do things that are physically challenging, and then to do those for really long periods of time. And that you can tilt that in a variety of different directions. So some people really marvel at the cardiorespiratory aspect of this thing, and Tour de France athletes and what they're capable of doing, and just the sheer workload that they're able to produce. Some people look at that more from a strength standpoint, and they will make really solid and detailed, robust arguments around strength and why physical fitness should really be centered around that. Some people might tilt it a little bit more on the movement side of things, being able to get it in and out of certain positions, accomplish certain tasks, learn certain tasks. You look at Cirque du Soleil performers, for example, and the way that people marvel at their bodies and the things that they can do, and might have that representation of it. And so I think that you can tilt that in a variety of different ways, and it becomes everybody's own personal interpretation of that conversation. But probably where that hashes out is something where you have this capability of doing a lot of different things, simultaneously. So in track and field, they call the best athlete in the world the decathlete, not because they're the best at the world in any one of those 10 events, but or certainly on the male side, it would be the heptathlete on the female side, but not because they're the best at all of those individual events, but because they have this great capacity to do a lot of different things. So that might be being able to deadlift or squat or bench press a certain amount, but also run a mile in a certain time, and then also have these capabilities of doing certain types of movements, climbing tasks, or whatever that might be. And certainly you have things like CrossFit and Fireman's Combat Challenge and all these different things now that are sort of like this athleticism that's really looked at from a magnitude of lenses, but really it's the combination of all of these things and having really no weakness. So I think that's really the one side that you look at it, and you can certainly tilt that in a variety of directions. The other side of it is looking at it more from a health perspective. So really looking at physical fitness in terms of survival and in terms of longevity, and really identifying what are the aspects of our bodies that need to be strong, and then what are the aspects of our bodies that are potentially problematic and inflammatory and toxic at the same time, and then how is that ecosystem navigating all these processes. And that's an interesting way to look at it, because I think we all know stories of somebody who was ripped and in really good shape and didn't drink or smoke, and then dropped dead at the age of 50 or 55 or 45 or whatever that might be. So we then start to ask, like, were they healthy? What is the different definition of health? or they fit even, and what is the overlap between those things. So I think now there's a lot of conversations around longevity, certainly because there's more knowledge than ever about that, and I think there's more interest in people living a longer life, and certainly having a longer health span in addition to a longer lifespan. So there's a lot of conversations around biochemistry, gut health, brain health, and just the decline of overall health and wellness, and the threat to survival. And looking at fitness more as a function of all of these different physiologic systems as opposed to these physical capabilities from an external standpoint. So those are really the two lenses that you look at it, and probably the unique lens that I might have. I think the one word that comes up for me is adaptability. So the adaptability of an organism within its environment, to me, is really the premium. And I think this shows up in sports, professional sports. I think this shows up in high achievement for human beings across a variety of disciplines. No matter what those disciplines are, it's this ability to withstand stress within your environment and then adapt to that stress in a positive way versus a negative way. And so that really encompasses mental, emotional, physical, physiologic. This adaptability takes it, in my opinion, to one step further, to this ever-changing organism that is constantly redefining what fitness is for itself, given its current environment.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. We've had conversations around this topic before, and you dovetailed into something quite nicely because I've had the fortunate experience of starting in the fitness industry and I moved into the health industry. I think you kind of started in the health industry, but because of your roles and responsibilities, you took a more vested interest in the health side of things from bridging it with fitness. You used the word adaptability. I love that. How do you practically look at adaptability to understand where the line between health and fitness is, and maybe what pushes someone over that line to where they get into a place of maladaptation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that it is situational, and I think you start with an outcome focused view and try to reverse engineer what's happening from there. So I was always really fascinated. I had an opportunity when I was a member of the Penguins to work with a gentleman named Coleman Ruiz, who had spent he was a longtime sort of decorated Navy SEAL and special ops commander who turned into one of the staff members who helped them develop their program and identify selection for their BUDS training program and whatnot. And Coleman's out there. You can look him up. He's got some interesting things online. And I remember learning a little bit about the parallels between the stress that's faced in professional sports and in military operations. We've talked about drafting and selection and stuff like that. And it was really very fascinating to know that sometimes in their BUDS program, which is a very famous sort of Navy SEAL selection training program, that you'd see these athletes that are stud athletes with incredible All-Americans, great athletes, like really straight A's, very athletically gifted, and almost instantly they could identify these ones that wouldn't make it almost upon their arrival, just based on their profile, because they just simply hadn't been exposed to enough stress and adversity in their environments. Things come relatively easy to them, and then you get these people who are in a constant state of stress and a constant state of chaos that actually do really well with these programs because they've just are adapted to that, and they have this ability to handle more. So very, very interesting as the environment change and the demands of the environment change. What determines fitness and what defines fitness or readiness or capabilities has to change with it. And so adaptability, I think, really is a premium that no matter where you go, you have this ability to positively adapt to whatever that stimulus is. So I look at training very much like this. All training and exercise is merely just a stimulus, a physical stimulus, and then there's an adaptive response to that stimulus. And so we're really just studying what the stimulus is and then what is the adaptive response and why. And that is really, I think, the conversation no matter what you're looking at. So I really define adaptability from an outcome standpoint. What is it that the individual is being exposed to? What is their reaction or response to that? And then why is their reaction or response what it is? And what do we think is underpinning the way that they're adapting to that, whether it's positive or negative? And then you can sort of either learn from it or troubleshoot it based on what you're seeing.
Which is a very similar parallel to doing clinical health practice, whether you're a doctor, a naturopath, whomever. you're trying to assess where the person is. What is their major issue? Why are they in your office and why are they seeking your help? And your interventions have to be decided upon based upon what the person's ready for. Can it fit into their lifestyle? Is it going to be too much of a stress? Is it going to be hormetically pushing them out of balance? Or is it going to be something that allows the body to come back into balance? You said something that was really interesting about looking at how much stress tolerance a person has. In health, a lot of the exercise advice that I've heard health professionals give are just go get some exercise, or just it's a very general statement without much thought because we assume exercise equals good. So, in the context of a non athlete, because I don't know that you get to talk about this very much, what is someone who may be in a compromised health state? How should they start to look at beginning a fitness regime or undertaking something athletic in that kind of endeavor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that is wide open for debate, and certainly you can find benefit from all all types of exercise. No matter what you're doing, there's going to be some physiologic response. For me, I probably would start more with cardiovascular fitness with somebody like that. I think it is closer to some of the innate mechanisms, like the autonomic nervous system, for example, that influence all systems. So I think you get a bit more bang for your buck with someone who's relatively untrained beginning a program. It's not to say that that is comprehensive in terms of the program that they should begin, but I think if you're trying to look for some low-hanging fruit, I think just some generalized sustained heart rate elevation that's controllable and measurable is a really good idea, whether you're using a bike, elliptical, going for a walk. I typically like this a little bit better than resistance exercise for heart rate elevation because it's harder to modulate the heart rate and understand where it is so that you have that feedback component to be able to say that was too high or that was too low, or I need to make this adjustment or change. So I think the cardiovascular side makes a lot of sense. There's certainly, when you get perspiration, there's a detoxification effect that occurs with that. I think that, certainly oxygen and energy is kind of an aspect of the body when you're working on those systems. It impacts and affects all other systems. Mitochondria, energy deficit in the body, these are the types of things that we know have instantaneous and global responses. I think the neuromuscular system is very interesting. It's very important. And I think it is probably more connected to the entire ecosystem than we think. I know there's a lot of research now on the importance of strength training for brain health and strength training for a variety of different types of endocrine responses, which we know, and certainly strength training for the orthopedic impact, whether you're working on bone density or joint health or whatever that might be, mood. So it's not to downplay that. I think it's just, what is the starting point and what is the first things first approach? I probably would start with the cardiovascular point and then work my way into some strength work. And then certainly there is that kind of movement, breathing component that just allows our body to be a little bit more successful in motion, that affects pain, that affects mobility, all of those types of things. Probably are working at having some kind of like movement component, some kind of strength component, some kind of cardiovascular component, with the cardiovascular component being maybe the starting point.
So it sounds like you're saying just because within strength training and some of these other movement-based practices, there's a lot more complexity going on than people really understand. Like if someone says, oh, just go join a CrossFit class. For most people, that sounds like just a normal thing. It's like, oh, I'll go CrossFit Zumba. I'm just going to go move a little bit. For someone like yourself, or even myself, like in this regard, I look at the biomechanical conundrum that I don't have any idea how to predict that outcome. And then I look at how much stress tolerance does this person have? Where are they starting from? And if they've been sitting on the couch for the last couple of years, I don't think doing a power clean or a power snatch or a 24-inch box jump is a great starting point. And the reason I ask that question is a lot of people who will watch this, they are not health professionals. And I do believe that the bridge between health and fitness needs to be strengthened in terms of understanding not only how one affects the other, and I believe health is the precipice to getting optimal performance, but in order to be able to understand how to accurately prescribe exercise, we need a starting point and we need a framework. I like that you went into the cardio stuff, because I've been digging into a lot of the zone 2 cardio. Would you say that's probably the best place if someone wants to research to dive deep into zone 2 cardio?
Yeah, I think that I'm a big fan of zone 2 work, as you know, and
Could you define that just for everyone so
yeah,
they understand
yeah,
exactly what we're talking about?
sure. So zone 2 is basically, when you start at around 50% heart rate and you go up from there, You sort of begin in zone 1, which is somewhere between 50 and 65% of your heart rate max. And this is a zone where you're probably getting some recovery benefit. So there's a blood flow component, there's removal of toxins, there's movement happening in the body. But there's very little like positive physiologic adaptation that's going to come from there. We would look at this as more of a recovery ride. So if we're just trying to get somebody moving and get them non-sedentary, zone 2, it has a slight increase in intensity that allows you, if it's done long enough and consistently enough, to not only increase that recovery response, that sort of regenerative exercise component, that would be really beneficial between 2 highly intense exercise bouts, for example, or just really beneficial for somebody starting out with exercise, but also has the ability to improve mitochondrial density and to lead to some positive physiologic adaptations as well. As you get to zone 3, it starts to become this kind of, complex combination of things happening. Now you're actually creating some metabolic byproduct and some toxins at the same time that you're attempting to remove it and accomplish some of these other things with respect to mitochondria. So, it sort of is like not intense enough to really gain any fitness or any real physiologic adaptation. And then it's also too intense to be purely restorative and from an exercise standpoint. So it's sort of in the middle where the bang for your buck is lowered a little bit with zone 3, unless that's like a very specific event that you're training for, where you need to spend some time in that zone. And again, this is, these zones will change a little bit as a percentage of heart rate max, but, let's say zone 2 is 65 to 75% of your heart rate max. Zone 3 is maybe, 75 to 85, something along those lines. And you get up into zone 4 and zone 5, and these are primarily for development of cardiorespiratory fitness and aerobic power and anaerobic power and things like that. But you're essentially training these higher level zones in a way that then you need to have recovery from that, right? So it's very interesting to see high intensity athletes that are exposed to high levels of anaerobic work and high levels of intensity, but they don't recover well from that work, really benefit from zone 2 work. Even with short bouts, I've actually found, I know to really put a dent in mitochondrial density, you need to do some longer bouts, like 40 minutes, like 4 or 5 times a week. But I've actually seen a lot of athletes, especially the NHL players, do really well with 20, 25 minutes of zone 2 work after games, after practices, just to gain some clearance and some recovery from that. So that's the cardiovascular side. And like you said, coming back to adaptability, and by the way, I'm just making note to myself to get rid of the program that I have that's box jumps and power cleans for the person starting.
No, it's power snatches and box jumps. Yeah, cleans are fine. It's anything overhead.
It's laughable, but you see this, right? You see people that just want exercise as a blanket recommendation, and there's classes and things. And what's very fascinating, like Orange Theory is this high intensity, cardiovascular work. I know you've got things like F45, which is high intensity. Everybody puts a premium on work and intensity because there are a lot of people that they're not very motivated and they have a really hard time pushing themselves physically. And so they respond well to these levels of motivation. But any practitioner that's working on somebody in terms of weight loss, in terms of inflammation, has gone through this process where they've done something like that and the person hasn't lost any weight, although they go the opposite way. They go the opposite way. They actually sometimes gain weight. And it's a moment to pause on for a second, because if you have any empathy in the world, imagine what it's like for that person to undergo this process where they're really motivated to do something. So there's something about themselves probably that they don't like, and they're vulnerable, and they're trying to push themselves. They're putting their faith and their trust and their vulnerability in your hands. You're absolutely crushing them through these workouts, yelling at them, and they don't get a good result, right? It's almost traumatizing. So I think when you go through that and you have to stop and reflect and say, what is happening here? Basically what it boils down to is, why is this person's system not adapting the way that person's system adapted? So now we have a difference in terms of adaptability. And so I think the way that we often learn for simplicity purposes is this is good for that. This type of exercise does that. And I think that it's like, well, it depends in whom and in what context and what situation, because
Mhm.
everyone is a little bit different. And so if you have somebody who doesn't have a very adaptable physical system, starting with a less is more approach, and what you're actually doing with zone two work is you're improving mitochondrial density, therefore making them more adaptable. So you're actually working on adaptability as a construct, as opposed to using it as an exercise tool. Is you're trying to get the system right, and that could be the same as cleaning up gut health before you do something very specific to treat an end organ, for example.
Yeah, there is an order of operations in which the human body likes to do things. And if your desires or your, affections for something are superseding where your body is, what's the old saying? The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Oh yeah,
And that can really happen, because it's so interesting. We talk about this approach to designing a fitness program. It's very similar when it comes to working in the clinical realms with people. And the populations I work with, as you know, are not gentle lambs. They're not necessarily canaries in a coal mine. But I still see that there are people who are the epitome of physical vitality, at least observationally on the outside. They still have a lot of gentle things going on inside of them, which they don't necessarily have context on, and it's limiting them. So imagine the average person who has not been playing sports since they've been 6 years old, who's been sedentary at an office job. This draw to want to be part of something, to want to push yourself and challenge yourself in a way that's all about intensity. I think the culture of that has really done the fitness industry and exercise as a disservice, because we assume that it has to be intense or else it's not beneficial. I remember one time I was training someone and he told me he didn't even sweat, and I told him to go sit outside in the sun in a snowsuit because he was expecting that he would sweat or else it wasn't a good perception of a workout. So I think setting the tone for people is really wise, because for some people, zone two is actually strength training. As weird as that sounds, it
yeah,
can actually be.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how you see, at the very basic level, somebody who's lifting a lot of weights, trying to put on some muscle, but they're not sleeping or they don't have their nutrition
Mhm.
right. I think that you have to look deeper into the adaptability spectrum and start to identify, what is adaptability from a physiologic context, and why would one person be more adaptable to one thing than another. One of the things that's really common right now, obviously, is cold water immersion therapy and cold plunges and things like that. And certainly, when you troubleshoot these recovery strategies with athletes, you will see some that are highly sympathetically dominant. They build cortisol and they release these sympathetic catecholamines, like a champ. And
One
they,
of them.
yeah, right, right. Me too. I joke
Yeah, there you
around.
go. We're both part of the club.
And cold water immersion therapy can be used more long term to be able to change the system a little bit, to maybe change in terms of core temperature and how that body reacts to certain things. But in the short term, like, it can be just the worst possible thing for them. It can create too much stimulation, and it can create a little bit too much activity in a system that's already overactive. Whereas some of the more passive strategies can be a little bit better. And so I think that is hard to have a one size fits all type thing. I think that you're going to have different. I think you can look at every stimulus. That what is the stimulus, and then how is my body going to adapt to that stimulus? Am I adaptable to it, and is that stimulus the right stimulus for me?
Mhm.
Certainly for somebody who already has a ton of energy, doing things to increase energy is maybe not necessarily the best thing. So I think we have a lot to unpack, I think, with that question in terms of like people's and their starting point. I wouldn't necessarily say that intensity is bad. Joining a CrossFit class or an Orange Theory class or something, one of those popular programs that are out there, could be really beneficial for some people. But I think it's important to consider the individual and consider what their primary needs are. And I am a big fan of the low level cardio on a consistent basis, to build some adaptability in the system, and cleaning up some nutrition, doing some really basic lifestyle stuff as a starting point. But certainly you would want to matriculate to a little bit of higher intensity cardio, some strength work, and some mobility along the way.
Oh, I think that's perfectly rounded out. In a vacuum, we could say some zone two as a base for people wanting to understand, okay, well, how do I maybe start planning this for myself? If you have it in you, some zone five, very short, intense bursts, maybe one or two times a week. And that kind of dovetails nicely into the strength side, because the benefit of exercise really is, besides improving the endocrine profile, improving the balance of the autonomic nervous system. We've talked about heart rate variability a ton over the last geez, year in these episodes that we've been doing. But building mitochondrial density is energy, and energy is everything when it comes to health. You know, I heard a saying, when our rate of injury exceeds our rate of repair, our body becomes diseased. So repair takes energy. And I think if we establish that as a first principle, that's a wonderful thing. But metabolic efficiency and metabolic power is also very much tied to muscle tissue and muscle mass density, if I am correct in saying that. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
So when it comes to some considerations for the every person, I know it's impossible for us to go specific, but when it comes to strength training, what are some guidelines or some strong general practices that you abide by when it comes to approaching this stuff?
Well, I think number one is really the technique of the movement, and really trying to get more muscle, less joint. Every time you put load onto the body, regardless of how you're putting that load onto the body, that load can be absorbed by any of the body structures. It can be joint based or it can be muscle based. Even within the soft tissues, it can be tendon based, it can be more fascial in nature, it can be more specific into the belly of the muscle. And so generally speaking, we want to try to take the pressure off the joints and put it into the muscle. So certainly the tempo of a movement, the position, the control, the cueing of the body's positioning, like in the setup and all that kind of stuff matters. There's some movements that are 70% joint stress, 30% muscle stress. And then there's the reciprocal of that. And then there's the really high quality movements that are 95% muscle stress. So I think that's one of the starting points, is really just focusing on technique of the movements. Separately from that, as you increase the velocity of the movement, the load does start to get a little bit more tendinous in nature. And then you're also using the central nervous system as a primary resource to be able to produce that movement. And as you start to slow it down, you're using less of the central nervous system, a little bit more of the peripheral nervous system. So if you have an athlete that is very centrally dominated in terms of how they produce power and how they generate force, you're probably going to want to take the reciprocal approach of slowing things down, doing a little bit more time under tension, working at loading those peripheral tissues a little bit more. And the reverse can be said for somebody who is very good at a peripheral level, but doesn't have that central mechanism driving the endocrine response that's necessary from these workouts to produce adaptation. So for those people, some high intensity interval work or some intense movements with a little bit of velocity can work really well. I think what the pitfall that people fall into with strength training is they look at a concept like velocity-based strength work is better than more isolated, more focused strength work, or global movements are better than barbell work. I think it really just depends on the context and it depends on what you're trying to do. But a good starting point is just focusing on the quality of the movement. And then from there, try to ascertain how much of the movement is peripheral in terms of the stress load and how much of it is central in terms of the stress load. That has a lot to do with the speed of the movement. And then I think probably the third thing from there is looking at movement in 3D. So trying to look at cross-lateral patterns and fascial slings and trying to combine upper body and lower body into some strength training movement probably has some application to strength training that transitions into life. So whether you're playing a sport that requires these multidimensional movements, or whether you're just a human being that wants to have like good health, I've met a lot of people who are great in the gym, very muscular, very fit, but they have shoulder pain, they have back pain, neck pain, or they have some dysfunction, or they have difficulty doing certain things. And, trying to get them to look at things less in isolation and a little bit more globally and understand how one part of the body relates to the next is sort of that continuum. So you really have three spectrums: the nervous system, versus neuromuscular system. You have the global versus isolated movement spectrum. And then you have the speed versus control, type of spectrum. And I think that you could probably, try to get a bit of an understanding of where you are on that spectrum and try to train the reciprocal, in my opinion, is going to give you the best response.
You may have answered this indirectly, but I'm going to ask it more accurately. So we have those variable characteristics within the human body, the performance, if you will. As we age, as we get into our fifth, sixth, seventh decade of life, my understanding is we lose that explosiveness, that very quick, central dominant aspect of our nervous systems as they operate our muscles. And the things that we seem to lose more slowly over time is that slow contractile strength in general. I know there's people's predisposed aspects. What are your thoughts are when there are people saying, well, you need to stimulate power training as you get older, else that's why you may slip and fall on the ice and, hurt yourself. Do you think those things as general rules are important concepts?
Yeah, it's a very good concept. Let's just take slipping and falling from one standpoint and unpack that. I think it would be a little bit dogmatic to take any one thing and say, well, you need this for that, because that is really a thing that's including a lot with the vestibular system, motor control, balance.
Mhm.
And I think there's a reflexogenic component to that. So even a lot of high velocity, power focused strength work is coming up short in terms of specificity there. So I would
Mhm.
say that, I wouldn't say power is necessarily related to that. However, I am a fan of power training, because I think that there's probably some important nuance associated with adaptability in your training, where once you start a very specific style of training and you keep that style of training for a certain period of time, you plateau and you stop adapting. And certainly we've all seen these people. I know you go to a gym and you see somebody who is doing the exact same thing that they've been doing 20
Look
years
the same
ago.
for the last
Look
10
the
years.
same total training. They obviously are really enjoying being in there. But, if you're somebody who's laid a really nice foundation, maybe that next step is to produce that purely from the standpoint of creating a stimulus. I'm now stimulating some aspect of that neuromuscular system and my nervous system that I haven't stimulated before. And I really believe it is the growth phase where all the good comes in. It's that stimulating phase where the body says, my level of homeostasis is not well suited for this. So I have to be able to produce change. And that change is very positive from an endocrine standpoint and very positive from an exercise physiological standpoint. So I think that there is benefits, and certainly a lot of people may have had clients or customers come in and they've trained a certain way and they said, let me introduce you to my style. And then they get these incredible results and they feel better and they notice right away. And so you can do the flip side of that. You can have somebody who's doing a lot of powerlifting that responds really well to almost like a bodybuilding time under tension type program, a little bit more stability, some really interesting things in new positions, or trying to get certain muscles recruited that simply don't recruit very well because there's muscle imbalances going on there. So I think that I've seen that reciprocal, people who are very rigid in terms of their adaptation, and then they do really well when they get exposed to something different. So that's the one part of it. The second part, why it might matter, has, I think, less to do with the functionality of the power work. Like in our world these days, we're not really in these situations a lot where we're really trying to do these things, and we're human beings. We're not that powerful anyways, actually. So
Not relative to the rest
no,
of nature. No, we're
like,
quite
like
unimpressive.
if you try to lift a car off your friend, it's like,
Yeah.
your deadlifts in the gym aren't going to get you there.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I think you have to love it. And there are some real benefits from doing it. But I would argue that's not that functional. What I would say is that there are benefits from an endocrine standpoint.
Mhm.
So now when we're talking about some of the exertional components to that, and overcoming inertia and the velocity components to those movements, actually, or even sprinting, or doing like some high effort type things that are powerful in nature, I do think there's very positive endocrine responses with that. Like certainly there's some good research on like some of the high intensity lifting and testosterone in men. There are certainly, I think, some really, really powerful adaptive responses. And so again, very, very good for pushing somebody past a plateau and maintaining that. I think that there should be a component to it. The last argument probably is something in and around bone density, and
Mhm.
possibly like using that load to allow bones to be strong in a very specific way. I definitely think that there's something there. So I think that there are some benefits for sure, and I would definitely include it in anybody's program. But I wouldn't necessarily think that the argument is in and around activities of daily living per se.
Yeah. It's not quite a purely use it or lose it kind of scenario, unless you
Yeah.
are attempting to slide on ice, because you do live in the east coast of Canada at some point in the year, and
Oh
that
yeah.
is a very real hazard to you.
100%. Well, what's very interesting to me is the power work does have an injury prevention component to it. And I think one of the reasons is because it's a little bit less of the outward expression of that power and a little bit more about what happens to the system when you expose it to those types of loads. So as we mentioned, when you move something, I mean, the difference between strength and power is that you're starting to move something very quickly now, right? So
Mhm.
you're adding this velocity component to the force that you're producing. And so when you add velocity, you start to get more tendinous load, and so I think
Mhm.
there is value in strengthening and thickening tendons, and also just the tightening of the tendons around the joint has a very joint protective effect. And so, anybody with tendinopathy or any kind of tendon injury, and usually they've got all kinds of joint problems relating to that joint, movement problems, muscle inhibition. And so I think the same goes on the flip side. When you strengthen the tendons, you have like very good joint proprioception, you have very good stability, and the joints seem to be a little bit more resilient to these high velocity forces coming back into it when you're not prepared for something.
That's a really good insight because so few people emphasize the importance of the hypertrophy and the improvement in strength in the connective tissues. Because a muscle will adapt much faster than a ligament or a tendon will, because, well, that's the nature of a muscle tissue. It's got plenty of blood supply, it can remodel itself much faster. But, you hear these guys who are like, oh, I haven't played football for 20 years. I'm going to go out and run a 40 with my son, blows out a tendon or a
Oh yeah.
ligament
Yeah.
because their tissues were degraded to the point where they couldn't deal with the stress and the tolerances of the forces that were going through, the body at that time.
Yeah, no question. I've definitely seen a few of those, few of those muscle tears. You can,
See them like grab the hamstring, they go down like
yeah.
a ton of bricks.
Yeah,
Like that's a bad
exactly.
day.
Exactly
So
right.
that brings up another interesting thought because there is this camp that really is highly mobility and range of motion focused. We can call it active mobility, and we can also call it maybe some extreme static stretching, the Pilates, the animal flow crowd. Where do you think that fits in for, the average person, or where does that fit into what we've been talking about thus far?
I think there's a component to it. I think there certainly is. Where we um where I think these things become controversial is when they become dogmatic. So it's more of it's not that, it's this, this is what matters and here's why, and sort of comparing and arguing as to why something's important. But I think it really just lends itself to what are the activities of daily living that you have in your life. These are highly variable for a lot of people. Certainly at the base level, it's walking, sitting, getting in and out of cars, getting in and out of bed, being able to walk to the bathroom, walking on ice, whatever that might be. And that might now start to progress to some recreational sport activity. It might progress to some lifting or yard work or different things that you're starting to do. And so once you really define those and you start to train some of these patterns, you get a pretty easy construct to reverse engineer what you need to be able to do, right? And so
Mhm.
there are a lot of movements that you might not necessarily have to do a handstand, ever in life, right? It might not be that important. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can sort of unpack that. But is it beneficial to do a handstand? Maybe it's good from shoulder health. Maybe it's good for T-spine mobility. Maybe there's some benefits to it. So I think everything is really contextual. But at the end of the day, no matter what your level of activities of daily life are, whether it's playing sports, whether it's high intensity, cutting trees and carrying these things around, farming, or whether it's the basic activities of an office job, there is movement. There is global multi-planar locomotive movement involved in that. That is, it is highly subconscious in nature, so that you are essentially working on patterns of movement that you don't have complete voluntary control over in life.
Mhm.
You're not constantly setting up and it's not like when you go to bed, like you set your posture and then squat into a chair. A lot of times you're carrying something or you're off balance, you're thinking about something different. So that involuntary nature means we have to provide variable forms of stress that resemble, from a neuromuscular, a biomechanical, and a neurologic standpoint, those activities, if we want to be prepared to do those activities really well. And then I think that if you start with that definition of what does your life look like, what do you need to be able to do, it allows you to help prioritize. And because you may have somebody who shows up to Pilates and they say, oh, you've got this like stiffness in around your hips and your hamstrings, like that's the priority, when maybe doing a little bit of cardiovascular work or some strength training actually would alleviate that, right? It may be something where the reason why they're stiff is because they don't have the strength to be able to do what they're trying to do. And if they had the strength they could do what they're doing and absorb it in all the right areas, they would be taking that joint load off of their body. So where the priority is, I think, is always has to be reverse engineered from some concept of what do I need to be able to do? And then where is my body now? And then now I have to identify my priorities. In sports, we call these KPIs. And the way that I navigate KPIs is I try to rank them. And so it's basically saying, well, if I did just this, and just this, who would end up ahead, if I did that with the same individual, and what would be more valuable or more important. And then you can kind of create your priorities from that standpoint. But I really think all of these things, movement-based exercise, weightlifting exercise, cardiovascular work, like these are all really beneficial. It really comes down to the order of how you prioritize these things and in whom.
Yeah, I echo exactly what you said in terms of how you succinctly tied that up. I think something that might be an interesting exploration would be, okay, so we've got all of this information thus far. We have our basic understanding of what our different, categories are. How do we know how to track it? Like, how do we know that we're getting better? What are some strategies that maybe you've employed? Because I know you have to track both the health, the performance, and the recovery of athletes at the absolute top echelon of the NHL. For someone who's an individual or someone who's a clinician who's working in conjunction with a fitness professional, what are some best practices for making sure that I'm giving my client this encouragement, but I want to make sure that they're progressing positively and not getting into allostasis?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm a big fan of HRV, and I think HRV gives you some context around what's happening. So you have an athlete that, for example, they're losing range of motion, for example. The range of motion is decreasing. Okay, well, let's see if we can understand why that is. That's a little bit strange. So then we can try to understand, okay, are they recovering, or maybe is the workload a little bit too high? So I think it gives you like really good context. And certainly as you start to improve that cardiovascular system, you're going to see improvements in HRV. I think sleep is a really interesting thing, because sleep obviously it's a repair mechanism for everything you're doing during the day. And so as you change what you're doing in the day, chances are you're changing your sleep architecture. And so there's some really good things happening there. And then we know as that sleep architecture changes, HRV changes. So I like HRV because it's basically this kind of global system that affects so many different types of systems. And so it can be very contextual. I'm not a big fan of using HRV in a black and white context, like all good, all bad. You're at 98% recovery, so great job. You're only at 63% recovery, so you did something wrong. That 63% recovery is just an expression of physiology, and that might be the exact right expression of physiology at that time for you, right? So you can start to really use it more contextually, I think, to look at some of these things. I also think the measure of HRV is very important. As we talked about many times, it's really something that can be it can be inaccurate. It can be, when you try to simplify it and capture it on the fly, it can be really difficult. So I think when you clean up and you're very systematic and very consistent with what you do, it produces great data. And then also the type of tech that you use matters with HRV. Some wearables are simply better than others for that. So I'm a big fan of that. I like looking at heart rate during training, both resistance training and cardiovascular work. I think it does tell you some things. Again, it's very contextual. When you look at those curves, you can look at the intensity of the spikes across a certain set and see if we're able to maintain intensity. You can look at the nature of the drops. You can look at total work done over a period of time and quantify that. You can see whether the training is aerobic or anaerobic in nature. And you can, probably with some people, go, changing rest times from 60 seconds to 90 seconds, for example. There's some people that associate a positive training response to being fatigued, because there's endorphins that get released, and you start to get this sort of like reward-based system, like, wow, I've done something. But that might not necessarily be the goal. The goal might be more quality of movement, or it might be to try to reduce that stress response, maybe taking a little bit more breaks, maybe focusing on breath a little bit more, maybe focusing on the quality of the output as opposed to the overall kind of like stress on the system. So I think just heart rate and HRV are two of my favorites. And I think as we start getting more and more into the additional ways of looking at the system, so whether it's using blood or saliva or urine, whatever that is, to be able to look at that over time and just see how the system is adapting and see what types of response they're going well. I'm a big fan of, when the system is at its best, what does it look like and what's going on, as opposed to predefining whether the system is good or bad with a construct, because I think that varies from everybody.
Yeah, and you need to be able to understand the pattern of that person that you're dealing with and understand all the variables that go into figuring out, what variables are pushing them this way or versus that way. The last question I have is a little bit of a Pandora's box, and it might not be enough time to get a good answer. But in the context of supplementation and athletics and fitness, how do you approach the use of supplements, the potential selection parameters? Are there any aspects of supplements that you find lend themselves well to both improving health and improving performance? What is your experience there?
Yeah, that is a really deep dive for
It is a
sure.
deep dive.
Yeah.
You can give us the skim if you want.
Supplements, I for those that don't know me, like I've been known to carry suitcases of supplements around. I like to experiment on myself and try a lot of different things. So I think primarily from experience more so than expertise. I'm a big fan of supplementation in general, but I think that I've definitely made the mistake myself of trying to take everything that has potential good, being a little bit more selective. Like I
Mhm.
may not need 5 different adaptogens and a mushroom complex and, 4 or 5 different types of like, endocrine stimulants, that work from a botanical standpoint. Like I might be able to pick one and just go from there. I also think that again, everything comes back to adaptability. So I think from a supplementation standpoint, it is a supplement. I think we really want to try to support what you have. So if we start getting into um, vitamin D, for example, vitamin D is going to have a greater impact on you the more there is a deficiency in vitamin D, right? If you get somebody who is not, even insufficient in vitamin D, they have very good levels. Maybe that supplement is not necessarily going to be as powerful for them in terms of what it does for them. And certainly, I think you can go across the board with a lot of different supplementations, magnesium, various nutrients, and different types of herbal adaptogens. I think it's a where and when type of thing. Nutrients, amino acids, as you know, even just the macronutrients and understanding like protein requirements and amino acids and the use of these different types of things in different situations. There are a lot of people that do really well with very minimal, and then there's other people that need like high levels of supplementation to get the response that they need. And so
Mhm.
I think all of this is contextual, and there's sort of a matrix of information that you take in to really answer those questions, as opposed to a blanket, this is kind of great for everybody. The one thing I would say is like, if there's one thing that everybody is dealing with, it's probably some level of gut-based inflammation or some level of gut immune response that's producing lack of adaptability in the tissue, certainly brain, sleep, some different things. So things that generally can care for the gut. And I know that there's some variance in that as well, I think could be really valuable. And I think separately from that, just really looking at the diet and trying to identify based on your style of diet, are there any deficiencies that your body needs? And trying to identify that. But there's nothing like getting to know the individual, to answer some of those questions on supplementation.
Hugely. I mean, I can just speak from my own experience in the last couple of years that I've yet to meet an athlete who I would say has a healthy gut. And
Very
so much
fair.
so that I encourage the owners of the company to get some sport banned substance testing done on a couple of our products, just for the very nature of the world of sports is it's very choosy when it comes to its products. Because if you don't have a certification, why would someone risk a $50 bottle of something potentially to lose a
Yeah.
contract or get suspended, whatever?
Yep.
But I think that's an underutilized, an under-focused area in the world of sport, because if you look at the stresses on the athlete, one of the first areas that starts to manifest itself is issues in the enteric nervous system. Because when you have the change in the autonomic balance, you start to get a sympathetically dominant state, which predisposes, increased transit time, hyposecretions of digestive aids, potential stimulation of gut permeability, activation of the immune system. And then you're adding in time zone changes, sleeping in different hotel beds, having a 200-pound guy run into you on the ice, playing under bright lights in the evening in the world of hockey. So I think it's a very huge opportunity for a lot of these guys, because I think a lot of the soft tissue stuff, this is just an insight that I have, especially centrally located around the groin area, the lower back, the hips. I would be surprised if there was not a gut connection to some of the things that a lot of these guys are dealing with, but no one has the know-how or even the thought process to potentially connect those two.
No question, no question. And I think one of the challenges is that it's not a thing that you can unwind really quickly. So if you have an
No.
injury that's a 6 to 8 week timeline, if there's an underlying mechanism that's systemic in nature, that's gut based in nature, this could take a year to really put a dent in terms of what you can do for it. And you're so right. Even just the environment, the buildings that they play in, the constant sweating, the microbes that they get exposed to. Certainly, there's levels of psycho-emotional stress, that play a factor in there, anxiety, that kind of stuff. But certainly just, yeah, whether it's exposure to alcohol, whether it's, the rigors of the sport, whatever it might be, again, at the end of the day, you have an athlete that's not adaptable, their tissue's not recovering, they're carrying a little bit too much inflammation. Usually you see this when you have an acute episode of an injury, like somebody went to plant and they got hit and they have an ACL tear, or they have a groin tear because they got a leg on leg contact in a certain situation. Usually those acute things, if they come and go in a reasonable timeline, you can chalk that up to like a separate incident. But any of the chronic stuff or the stuff that comes on over time, usually there's a systemic component to that, especially if they're experiencing inflammation in multiple areas of the body. So you see somebody that's not just their back, it's like my right lower back, my right hip, my right knee, my right shoulder. You start to see, okay, well, there's some biomechanical issues here, but chances are there's inflammation happening systemically that's contributing to what's going on in the body versus one isolated certain situation. And then there's the other one, which is the acute to chronic, which is it started with one episode, which was relatively innocent. And then it's that episode in and of itself was so much of a disruption, it actually affected the health of the individual. I think that's why some of the really passive, like return to play models are very problematic, because there's loss of like normal physical activity, loss of fitness, and then the athlete is now going back into it in a less adaptable and a less ready state.
That comes back to that word adaptability. I mean, I can think of one specific athlete that you and I both know, and I remember asking him his health history, and he said at one point when he was 12 years old, he was bedbound with what he assumed to be the world's worst flu for a good solid 7 to 10 days, and never was quite the same after that.
Wow.
And this is
Wow.
20 years on, which is kind of an
Yeah.
interesting thing to put together, because very few strength coaches will probably go, so did you have any really bad viral infections when you're sub 14? And I
Absolutely.
think that kind of rounds everything out so nicely, because you see the interconnection or the interconnected nature of health and performance, of health and fitness. And I just feel like we're getting warmed up, and we could probably just put some coffee on and get going for another hour. But what I think we'll do, if it's okay with you, is we'll take a few questions. We'll just pause so we can end the recording, and then we'll have a few people ask some questions, and we'll call it a day if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, awesome. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you so much for all of your expertise, your knowledge, and there's going to be a lot. There are some people live, but this will be seen by many people after the fact. So, is there anywhere that you're able to be found, or anything that you want to, announce that you're working on, or you're just staying in the shadows like I do, just kind of keeping a low profile and enjoying life?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the trenches a little bit,
Yeah.
working at the sports agency called Cortex Management, which is representing primarily hockey players right now. And a side business from that operation is this company called Junction Performance, which we have locations in Toronto and Montreal, training professional developing athletes, executives. And then, also with my role with the Florida Panthers, really just assisting them and building out their framework for the types of practitioners and how that flows and the roles, and, how to use that as a part of the competitive advantage. So it's been fun to see all my colleagues, reaping the rewards of their hard work throughout the season.
Well, just the simple fact that you have taken a team that barely eked into the playoffs and now is going on an epic run and probably is going to play in the Stanley Cup final very soon. Congratulations to you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I wish I could take the credit for it, but it's been really fun to be a part of something like that.
We'll throw 3 to 5% your way.
Like,
All
were
right.
there some questions or anything that we needed to
Yeah.
in, or?
Yeah. So there's 3 questions. First and
Okay.
foremost, Doug was asking, what about time under tension? So I'm assuming this came in as we were in the midst of talking about different kinds of strength training stimuli.
Hmm.
If any thoughts, any insights on the mechanisms of time under tension and its benefits?
Yeah, exactly. I think, well, this is essentially kind of a measure of like just how long is the muscle under load, without looking at the necessarily the intensity of the load. So it's basically typically it involves like slowing down the movement and improving the quality of the movement, uh, so that you're, doing like these longer, like eccentric and concentric phases of an isokinetic like muscle contraction. And as you're doing that, like typically what you're doing is you're removing the velocity out of the movement and when you're increasing these like controlled tempos. And so it does tend to be a little bit more peripheral in terms of that stress response. So you're focusing a little bit more on the muscle organ itself as opposed to the central nervous system. So you're not getting that arousal component at the central level. So the underlying physiology is just quite different. So if I have somebody who's hyper aroused, highly sympathetic dominant, high heart rate, has no problems getting up, then I typically am going to focus a little bit more peripheral and, really trying to slow down that central nervous system. And there's tons of people that respond really well to this, where they slow things down. They take a little bit more of a muscle focus. They do really well, both from a health, anti-aging standpoint, endocrine adaptability, in terms of even with some athletes, they say their joints feel a little bit better. They feel a little bit more anabolic in nature. And then you take somebody who doesn't have a very active central nervous system and is like more kind of hardwired in that parasympathetic response. And that could be like the worst possible way to train that individual, right?
Makes them more like that.
Makes them more like that, and so these are athletes you're trying to get a little bit of speed, a little bit of stimulus, mainly because I'm a big believer in that if you want to produce a stimulus that's worthy of response, you're going to have to try to get into somebody's weaknesses. And that's usually where the area of opportunity is. So that's typically why I look at these reciprocals and I try to approach it with some polarity.
Got it. Wonderful answer. Thank you. The next question was muscle confusion by Tony Horton. I'm guessing someone's wanting to know what your opinion of the muscle confusion concept is, other
Yeah,
than its fun marketing play.
right. Yeah, I mean, I very rarely think of a muscle as being confused. I think from a terminology standpoint, I look at it more in terms of the stimulus itself. So the idea is, to try to hit it with something that it's not really adapted for. So from that standpoint, like muscle confusion could be that you're throwing a lot of different things at it. So chances are, like, regardless of what your starting point is, you're probably going to have some benefit from that. Probably good at breaking through plateaus. I think you can be a little more specific in terms of identifying, well, where is the individual at? What's their, typical style of training? And maybe we can introduce something that's newer, different. And there are a lot of people, certainly in the athletic world, that would say, why would you want to expose somebody to something that's different than what they are? This is an individual that's hardwired for power. They just need power. They need to be exposed to that. I'm a big fan of, like I said, introducing levels of polarity when it comes to training, certainly at certain phases. Obviously, as you prepare an athlete for a sport, you have to consider what they're going to be doing in sport and what's important as it gets closer to their competitive cycles. But certainly when you're trying to create an adaptive response, whether it's at an endocrine level, a neuromuscular level, a neurologic level, you really have to expose it to something that the body perceives as a stimulus that's beyond where its homeostatic capabilities are. And the greatest area of opportunity and bandwidth to do that are working on somebody's weaknesses.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. No offense to Tony Horton. Maybe the muscle is confused because it identifies as a tendon. Maybe that's what it really is.
Yeah, the muscle has some identity issues. That's
It's
probably,
confused. It doesn't know if it's a muscle, or maybe it thinks it's the fascia.
yeah.
The last the last question is, what about hyperbaric oxygen for recovery?
I think hyperbaric oxygen is great. I do. I think that if you're somebody who needs recovery, and certainly like we're talking about, the heart rate speeds up, and we create these stress responses, which is like our paradigm and understanding is stress response, fight or flight syndrome, increasing cortisol, elevation of heart rate is all bad, right? And we look at these as like these chronic stimulations and elevations, and we need things like deep breathing, and we need meditation, and we need some different things to really take that down. And certainly if you're in that state, hyperbaric can play a role. It certainly can slow the heart rate down. It can improve oxygenation to the tissues. There can be a role in helping with inflammation and injury recovery with hyperbaric, as we know. It's pretty solid research out there. I think it's a really, really good tool. I will say that that stress response in some people is a good thing. and being able to maintain that is valuable. And the way that you dose hyperbaric is when you think that that is out of balance, right? So that you have that stress response that's maybe too high or too long, and you need to start using complementary therapies. So rather than just jump in, 1 day a week, as a means of using it, I actually like using it in concentrated doses. So for like more frequently, maybe every day for 90 minutes, over a period of time, to help the body adapt through some level of stress that it's not adapting through. And I think that, post injury, I think going through like intense bouts of physical activity, stress in life, decreased exposure to sleep over periods of time, there's a time and place for hyperbaric, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And you hit on something that I think is worth me saying out loud. There is this kind of narrative or motif where people are saying, "Oh, you need to get into parasympathetic. You need to do this." And I think I know what they're trying to say. They're saying you don't want to be stuck in sympathetic. But if people realize that if you get someone stuck in parasympathetic, that's the equal opposite problem,
Exactly.
because they become the couch, as you said before,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we have to understand that every breath in, every breath out is sympathetically and parasympathetically mediated. The healthiest person has a perfect theoretical balance between accessing of the two in the most optimal way at all times, given every potential external and internal circumstance and stress. So when we're
Absolutely.
using these things, we have to understand the true context, and we have to be careful of how sound bites can sound right, but they're actually half truths, which usually lead to full lies.
So true. So true. Well, a big part of it is how we learn, right? We learn that something is either
Exactly.
all good or all bad, or something does this or doesn't do that. But yeah, there's no question, deep dives on the individual will help to guide you in some of these decisions for sure.
Well, Andy, I can't thank you enough. I mean, I love when we get the opportunity to do this. It's few and far between these days because we're both busy, but I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, likewise. All right. Great to see you, Roland. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Have
See
a
you
good
then.
one, buddy.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.